St. Aelred of Rievaulx and Friends, English Cistercian Spirituality. I'd like to begin this lecture with some words from Professor of the College of William and Mary, Philip Dayleader. He says, "Imagine a life in which you are not permitted to sleep for more than 2 or 3 hours at a time, because throughout the day and the night you awoke periodically to do your never-ending work. This is a life of extreme austerity in which you are constantly struggling to control the two most fundamental biological urges, to eat and to reproduce. You are constantly trying to reduce your intake of food to the minimum necessary for survival, and you are constantly trying to remain celibate. If you are in quest of such a life today, you would be well advised to enroll in a doctoral program and go to graduate school. But in the Middle Ages, you would have joined a monastery. And by the year 1000, the dominant form of monasticism was Benedictine, a monasticism that was derived from the rule of St. Benedict, written by Benedict of Nursia of the 6th century, who was popularized by our friend Gregory the Great. And these monasteries were located deep in the countryside of Europe because isolation made it easier for monks to shed worldly concerns. And the monastic life was devoted to manual labor, study, reading, writing, and reflection, Lectio Divina, and prayer, performance of the liturgy. So ora and labora, prayer and work. And the monks would take 3 vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity. And each day they would follow the 8 liturgical hours, or the 8 canonical hours. They would pray at matins at sunrise, prime at 6 a.m., terce at 9 a.m., sext at noon, none at 3 p.m., vespers at sunset, and then compline before bed, and then vigils at 3 a.m. There is a Cistercian monastery called the New Clairvaux in a town called Vina, California, a few hours north of me. And they all get up at 3 a.m. and walk almost a quarter of a mile to their chapel to pray vigils and to pray all these prayers. And they expect all their visitors to do the same. It is not a natural feeling to wake up at 3 a.m. to go walk in the dark to a chapel to pray for about half hour. But that is the life of a Benedictine. And the abbot is responsible for enforcing this rule of St. Benedict and making sure that the monks are not sleeping in through their prayers. And the values that were drilled into the monk were obedience, humility, and stability. And these 8 canonical hours, this life of prayer and work, helped drill in these values. Now, who joined the monasteries in medieval times? Well, there were some people who joined the monasteries for religious reasons, thinking that the rigor of the monastic life would guarantee salvation. As we talked about with red martyrdom and white martyrdom and gloss martyrdom, this is sort of a form of white martyrdom. You could not just go to your Roman magistrate and tell them you're a Christian and get that guaranteed ticket to heaven by being martyred through red martyrdom, but you could abstain from natural pleasures like food and sleep. Not just natural pleasures, but human need. And that could help guarantee salvation in their minds. But also many people had non-religious reasons for joining the monastery. Many elderly people retired in monasteries. They were medieval retirement homes. It was a place where they were guaranteed to be fed and clothed. And sometimes kings would dump unwanted political enemies and political prisoners and exiles in monasteries. But the largest number of non-volunteers were the oblates. The oblates were young children given to a monastery, and the monks would accept responsibility for raising the child, and the child was given a choice at a certain age to stay in the monastery or go out into the world. There was the practice of primogeniture, in which the firstborn of a family was given the bulk, if not the entirety, of the inheritance, and the other sons would be sent off to the monastery. Monasteries and monastic communities would often start out austere, but over the years they tended to ease up and relax when it came to following the relatively strict rule of St. Benedict. And I lived in several intentional communities with young adults. And my experience is that we always begin very ambitious, promising, okay, we're going to pray together twice a day, we'll eat meals once a day, we'll engage in some form of outreach together at least once a month. And within the first few months, we tend to follow that. But then as months go by, we become much more lax. It just tends to be the way of humans' spiritual entropy, unless there's some real accountability. If the accountability is just within the community itself, it's easy to just let things go by. And so that was the case with monasteries in medieval times. And there were many other reasons contributing to this laxity. One reason for this was monastic wealth, which was not a reason for our laxity in our intentional communities at all. We were all very poor students or youth ministers, graduate students. But one reason for laxity in medieval monasticism was monastic wealth. Although individual monks could not own property, the monasteries themselves could, as corporations, own a great deal of property. And by 1000, monasteries owned a considerable amount of property in Europe. And elderly people and parents of oblates would give very generous donations. And then noble families would sometimes give huge endowments to monasteries, expecting prayers in return, expecting the monks to pray for them daily or several times a day. So it was very difficult to live austerely when you were surrounded by wealth and opulence. Also, the oblates, who were dumped off at the monastery by the families, often did not have a vocation to be a monk and really did not want to be there. So their presence contributed to overall laxity. So because of this general easing up on following the rules of St. Benedict, there were two major reform movements in high medieval monasticism. Movements that set out to revive the strict obedience to the rule of Benedict. The reforms are the Cluniac Reform and the Cistercian Reform. And both of these reform movements had initial success, which had diminishing returns over time. That success faded within 100 years or so. So first, the Cluniac Reform. Cluny was founded in 909. It's in central France. It's actually near Thésée, France. And Pope said that monks who were dissatisfied with their monasteries could go to Cluny, or a Cluniac monastery. So people actually wanted to be there. The monks who felt like they weren't getting enough rigor at their monastery should go to Cluny, or a Cluniac monastery. And Cluniacs would whip into shape other monasteries. And the Cluniacs became very famous for their length of prayers, which is somewhat ironic since in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, do not go on and on in your prayers. But either way, they said far more prayers than they were actually supposed to, and they ended up neglecting their manual labor. So it was A little too much aura and not enough labora. They were too busy praying. And they would build these very large and ornate services, and their liturgical services were lavish. And in a worldly sense, the Cluniacs became very successful. Rich people were so impressed with these beautiful, lavish services and thought that their prayers would be extra effective, so they would donate great amounts of land and wealth to the Cluniacs in return for their prayers. And the more wealth the Cluniacs received, the less rigorous they became in observing the strict rule of St. Benedict. So by 1100, the Cluniac reform had basically run its course, and the monastery's reputation had diminished. So it was time for yet another reform movement, and that was the Cistercian reform. Now, Cistercian reform is based in the monastery of Citeaux, which is founded in 1098. And this reform had its heyday in the 12th century. And the leader of the reform movement was Bernard of Clairvaux. And Bernard of Clairvaux was a terrific orator. He was also a fabulous Latin stylist, and he was known as the mellifluous doctor. He was so gifted in his eloquence. And he was also extremely austere and very strict in his observation of the rule of St. Benedict, and strict with his fasting, so much so that he actually wrecked his digestive system permanently through his severe fasting. And contemporaries actually admired him for this. He was also extremely charismatic. He converted thousands of people to the Cistercian life. And during this time, during the High Middle Ages, conversion was a term used to refer not to a non-Christian becoming a Christian, but to a Christian becoming a monk. So Bernard of Clairvaux converted thousands of people. And the Cistercians expanded tremendously within a relatively short amount of time. So in 1118, there were 7 Cistercian houses. In 1151, soon before Bernard of Clairvaux died, there were 353 Cistercian houses. And then by 1200, there were 525 Cistercian monasteries. And they would refuse to accept oblates, which you could see might help kind of filter out those who don't want to be there and don't have a call. They also had less ornate liturgy. They refused certain amounts of income because they knew the danger of wealth. They also refused to wear underwear. Again, a sign of extreme austerity. But then, because they were so enormously successful, because of their austerity, they kept receiving wealth. So by 1200, if someone was rich, they were as, quote, rich as a Cistercian. And eventually, over time, the Cistercian reform movement became lax as well. But not without Bernard of Clairvaux leaving his permanent mark on Christian spirituality, and especially Cistercian spirituality. He is considered the last of the church fathers. And Thomas Merton wrote about him quite a bit because Thomas Merton was a Cistercian. He was a Cistercian of the strict observance, a Trappist, which is the order of the Cistercians of the strict observance. I want to look briefly at Bernard's 4 stages of love, which in some ways influence Aelred of Rievaulx, who is the English Cistercian that we will be looking at. Again, this is an English spirituality course. Bernard of Clairvaux was not English, but he had enormous influence on our English Cistercian. The first stage of love for Bernard was love of self for the sake of self. We take care of ourselves. We feed ourselves. We try to remain relatively healthy and clean because we love ourselves. We have to live with ourselves. We hopefully have some love for ourselves. The next stage is love of God for the sake of self. So we love God because we have learned that we will receive reward for loving God. We will receive reward in heaven, and we may also receive benefits in this life. We will receive abundant life here. So we love God because of the rewards and the benefits that we have been promised to receive for doing so. Now, what happens when we love God and we lose all those benefits? What happens when we love God and everything turns to crap? That's when we are invited into the third stage. That's the stage that some say Job was invited into. He was loving God, he was serving God, and then everything was destroyed and disappeared. And what will he do then? Will he still love God, even though God seems to have betrayed him and left him and destroyed his family and his life? His wife says, well, curse God and die. Move on. He says, well, naked I came to this world, naked I shall leave. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I'm going to continue to love God, not for the benefits he gives me, but because God is God. So this is what people call a disinterested love. It sounds kind of negative, but in some ways it's a much more mature love. It's a love that's not interested in what's in it for me. It's a love that is much more pure and unadulterated. A love for the other purely because the other is who he or she is. So it's love of God for God's sake. That is the third stage for Bernard of Clairvaux. Then there's a fourth stage, which Bernard talks about very carefully. He says, this might be a little too difficult, and very few people actually arrive at this stage. I think he says that probably because he knows it can easily be misunderstood and lead towards egoism and narcissism and solipsism. And he says the fourth stage is love of self for God's sake. I find this to be wonderfully profound. We are invited to love ourselves not because we think we're so great. We love ourselves because God made us, and God delights in us, and God thinks we're great. Thomas Merton talks about this beautifully. He says, the Christian answer to hate is not the command to love, but what must necessarily come before that, and that is to believe that you are loved. I think this is a helpful message, especially for people who struggle with self-hatred, which is quite ubiquitous, especially among millennials. Self-hatred is actually telling God that something he made is unworthy of love. Telling God that something he made is ugly and disgusting. So hating oneself is actually an affront to God. And I think Bernard of Clairvaux is pointing to this truth. He's inviting us to love ourselves, not because we're great, but because God is great and God made us and God delights in us and God is proud to call us his own. Gordon Mursell says, what interested the Cistercians was how we come to know the mystery of salvation through our own experience, precisely by living it. And it is this appropriating of objective truth as both a mainspring and a metaphor for the interior life which forms the essential heart of Cistercian spirituality. Gordon Mursell is the author of a wonderful book called English Spirituality from Earliest Times to 1700, which I would also recommend if you want to do further research on pre-Reformation English spirituality. So that gives us a broad overview of Cistercian spirituality. Now we can spend some time with our English Cistercian, Aelred of Rievaulx. Aelred was born in 1110, the same year that Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, died. He grew up in the household of King David of Scotland. He became a monk and then novice master at Rievaulx in England. He authored several texts, including A History of the Kings of England, a set of homilies on Isaiah, Lives of St. Ninian and Edward the Confessor, On the Soul, De Anima, so he wrote in Latin, Mirror of Charity, Speculum Caritatis, a treatise concerning Jesus as a boy of 12, as well as a rule of life for female recluses. And then his most famous, on spiritual friendship, De Spirituali Amicitia. And that's what you'll be reading from this week, not the whole thing, but a chapter. And Aelred has his own stages of love. He says there's first proper self-love. So he begins with a proper self-love, and then move on to love of neighbor. This seems to align with what Jesus says, as well as what Leviticus says. Love your neighbor as yourself. That command presupposes that we do have a love for self that is not entirely unhealthy. Our love of self is important and proper and a good foundation, and it allows us to understand how to love others, how to love our neighbors. And he says that there are sub-stages within the love of neighbor stage, and that's first love of immediate family, and then love of special friends, like our best friends, perhaps, and love of fellow religious, love of our fellow monks, those within our monastery, those within our community, and then love of fellow Christians, and then love of those outside the church, and then love of enemies. So it's beautiful that he starts with, in some ways, those people who are easier to love. Not that family is always that easy to love, but our best friends and those whom we choose to be close to tend to be easier to love. And he says, okay, let's build off of that. Okay, now let's build to all your fellow Christians. Okay, now let's build to those who aren't Christians. Okay, now let's build on that love to those who are enemies. So this progression from self-love via love of neighbor to love of God marks the rhythm of all spiritual progress for Aelred of Rievaulx. And for our spiritual practice this week, we're going to do a meditation inspired by Aelred of Rievaulx and his magnum opus on spiritual friendship, as well as a Buddhist practice called metta, M-E-T-T-A, which is Pali for compassion, loving kindness, friendliness. And that practice will be guided by a YouTube video. I usually do it with my class in person. It creates a beautiful space when it's done with a group of people. And if you can do it with a group of people, that would be wonderful as well. It creates a beautiful energy. And Aelred's words from Spiritual Friendship shimmer with extra effervescence and life and light. One final comment on Aelred of Rievaulx. There's a book by Yale history professor John Boswell called Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality, in which he looks at Aelred's emphasis on friendship, especially with other men, and says there can be little question that Aelred was gay and that his erotic attraction to men was a dominant force in his life. As a result, Boswell's interpretation inspired the LGBTQ Episcopal group called Integrity to name St. Aelred as their patron saint. That adds an interesting perspective on Aelred. It's certainly not something we can know for sure, but he definitely does talk about being physically comfortable and intimate with his fellow monks and his close friends. So I hope that this is an opportunity for you to reflect on your own friendships and be nourished by the love of your friends in order to expand your loving circle to include those who are more difficult to love.